Welcome back, Real Reels family. First off, I want to thank each and every one of you for your incredible support. You make this journey possible. If you're new here, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and join us as we dive into fascinating alternate realities of history's most iconic figures. Today we're embarking on a special divergence in our What If series. While we've explored alternate realities of legendary musicians, this time we're stepping into the life of a notable individual who changed the world in a completely different way. If Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had survived the assassination attempt on April 4th, 1968, his life, career, and impact on American society would likely have unfolded along complex and multifaceted lines. Here's AI's detailed analysis of the most probable path based on his life, relationships, convictions, and the socio-political context of the time. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a transformative leader in the American civil rights movement, renowned for his unwavering commitment to nonviolence and equality. Born on January 15, 1929, in Atlanta, Georgia, King grew up in the shadow of systemic racial segregation, but was deeply inspired by his faith and the teachings of Mahatma Gandhi. His powerful oratory skills and visionary leadership galvanized millions as he advocated for racial justice, economic equality, and peace. Leading monumental events such as the Montgomery bus boycott and the 1963 March on Washington, where he delivered his iconic "I Have a Dream" speech, King became a symbol of hope and resilience. His efforts culminated in significant legislative victories, including the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, for which he received the Nobel Peace Prize. Tragically, his life was cut short on April 4th, 1968, when he was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. Despite his untimely death, King's legacy endures as a beacon of justice, inspiring generations to continue the fight for equality and human rights. If King had survived, he would likely have been gravely injured, requiring a significant period of recovery. His survival would have turned him into an even larger symbol of resilience and moral authority, galvanizing the civil rights movement at a time when it was fragmenting under pressure from more militant factions like the Black Panther Party and ideological disagreements. Despite his injuries, King's primary focus in 1968 was the Poor People's Campaign, a movement to address systemic poverty across racial lines. Surviving the assassination would have allowed him to lead the campaign in Washington, D.C., however. The campaign was already plagued by logistical and strategic challenges. King might have achieved greater visibility for the issue, but the campaign would likely still have faced pushback from the Nixon administration and apathy from a war-weary public. By the late 1960s, King's focus had shifted from civil rights legislation to broader issues of economic inequality in opposition to the Vietnam War. This shift alienated many of his allies, including President Lyndon B. Johnson, who had been instrumental in passing the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The FBI's campaign to discredit King, led by J. Edgar Hoover, would have intensified. Surviving the assassination could have emboldened Hoover, who might have leaked more damaging details about King's private life, including allegations of extramarital affairs and rumored financial mismanagement within the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC. Public revelations of King's flaws could have significantly tarnished his moral image and strained his relationships with supporters. King's steadfast commitment to nonviolence increasingly placed him at odds with younger, more radical leaders like Stokely Carmichael and the Black Panthers. These groups might have criticized King as out of touch or ineffective in addressing the structural violence of racism. As King continued his anti-war rhetoric, he might have been further marginalized by both political and public spheres. The Nixon administration, elected in 1968, would have viewed King as a destabilizing force, and his efforts to build coalitions across racial and class lines could have been met with hostility from the predominantly white middle class. By the 1970s, King might have considered entering electoral politics. There was precedent for this. Andrew Young, one of King's close allies, transitioned from the SCLC to become a U.S. congressman, UN ambassador, and eventually mayor of Atlanta. If King had run for office, his platform would likely have centered on economic justice, workers' rights, and dismantling systemic racism. King's candidacy, however, would not have been without challenges. His association with socialism, which he had subtly endorsed, and his critiques of capitalism might have alienated mainstream voters. Additionally, ongoing FBI leaks could have been weaponized against him by political opponents. King's intense schedule and the FBI's harassment had already taken a toll on his marriage to Coretta Scott King. Surviving the assassination would likely not have mended these strains. Coretta, a formidable figure in her own right, might have sought to carve out more of her own legacy as an activist, potentially leading to further distance in their relationship. By the late 1970s, King's brand of nonviolence might have been seen as increasingly outdated in a world grappling with stagflation. The aftermath of Vietnam and growing urban unrest, younger generations of activists might have regarded him as a relic of a bygone era. As a Nobel Peace Prize laureate, King might have turned his attention to international issues. He had already expressed interest in connecting the struggles of African Americans to the global fight against colonialism and apartheid. His voice could have been instrumental in rallying American support for anti-apartheid movements in South Africa. Aging and evolving societal contexts might have softened King's influence domestically. His core message of nonviolence and reconciliation might have been overshadowed by the rise of figures like Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton, who adopted a more media-savvy and combative approach to civil rights. Personal struggles. King's personal life, including his alleged affairs, would likely have continued to generate controversy, especially in an era of increasing media scrutiny. While his supporters might have defended his humanity, detractors would have used these revelations to undermine his moral authority. Tensions with black leadership. King's insistence on coalition building across racial lines might have alienated black radicals who viewed class-based unity as diluting the unique struggles of African Americans. Impact of FBI records. In this timeline, FBI records of King's personal life and alleged improprieties might have been released earlier, leading to a more complicated public perception of him. These revelations could have jeopardized his reputation as a moral leader. Had King died of natural causes in the 1980s or 1990s, his legacy might have been less pristine than it is today. Without the martyrdom conferred by his assassination, King's later years might have been marked by controversies over his evolving strategies and personal choices. However, his foundational contributions to civil rights would still have ensured his place as one of the most significant figures in American history. I ask AI, would MLK Jr. have supported reparations for slavery, and in what form would he have thought it should come? And this is what it said. Yes, Martin Luther King Jr. would likely have supported reparations for African Americans, but his vision of reparations would have been rooted in collective uplift rather than direct cash payments. His advocacy for economic justice and equality often framed reparations not as an individual payout, but as a systemic restructuring of society to address the historical and ongoing impacts of slavery, segregation, and systemic racism. Here's how he might have conceptualized and advocated for reparations based on his known beliefs and speeches. King viewed poverty as a critical issue intertwined with racial inequality. In his 1964 book, Why We Can't Wait, he explicitly stated that America owed a massive redemption of a past injustice to African Americans, comparing it to reparations given to Holocaust survivors and Japanese Americans interned during World War II. He argued for systemic investment to rectify centuries of economic exploitation, saying,
"A society that has done something special against the Negro for hundreds of years must now do something special for the Negro."
King's ideas suggest he would have supported reparations in the form of transformative programs aimed at collective economic empowerment, community development, and dismantling structural barriers. Possible approaches include targeted economic programs, community development. King would have likely advocated for major federal investment in black communities, including infrastructure, housing, and small business funding to close the racial wealth gap. Guaranteed income. King was an early advocate of a universal basic income, which he believed would help all Americans, but especially African Americans disproportionately affected by poverty. This could be framed as reparative justice through a nationwide economic safety net, land grants, and housing equity. King might have supported initiatives to provide land ownership, housing subsidies, or debt forgiveness specifically for African Americans, acknowledging how discriminatory housing policies had undermined Black wealth. Educational equity. King believed in education as a path to liberation. He likely would have supported free or heavily subsidized college education for African Americans, investment in historically Black colleges and universities, HBCUs, and improved public schools in underserved communities. Programs such as scholarships, teacher training, and curriculum reform would align with his vision of reparations as a tool for empowerment, workforce, and employment opportunities. King was deeply concerned with economic opportunity and dignity in labor. Reparations might have included large-scale employment initiatives, workforce training programs, and preferential hiring practices to rectify generations of systemic exclusion from high-paying industries. Structural wealth redistribution. While King was not a socialist in the strictest sense, he believed capitalism needed significant reform to address inequities. He might have advocated for a tax on corporations or wealthy individuals to fund reparations, framing it as moral accountability for economic exploitation. King would likely have framed reparations not as punitive, but as an act of national redemption and reconciliation. He believed in unifying people across racial and economic lines, so his proposals would have emphasized shared benefits and a stronger democracy. He might have stressed that reparations are not about handouts, but about correcting injustices that have handicapped African Americans for centuries.
The man is not truly free if he must fight for the basic necessities of life,
King said, emphasizing systemic solutions. If Martin Luther King Jr. had survived, he would have continued to fight for justice, though his later years would likely have been marked by political isolation, personal struggles, and an evolving civil rights landscape that sometimes left him behind. His unwavering commitment to nonviolence and justice would have cemented his legacy as a transformative, if imperfect, leader, but the path would have been far messier and more contentious than the idealized narrative we hold today. Thanks for exploring MLK's What If? Like, comment, and subscribe for more alternate realities.